Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. Those of us who actually are studying Korea really find it rewarding that you guys would do this. You've heard a lot about me. But I want to ask a question, which is, why is Korea interesting? And I'm sure you've done this before, but like, why are you here? There's a number of reasons. I actually would have suspected mostly was because you have students. But then there are a whole bunch of substantive reasons, right? I mean, so in some ways, the question is, why would you take some time out for Korea, right? And so what I'm going to do today is basically historical Korea, and then talk about the 20th century really quickly. And my goal is not to give you all the facts, but rather to give you a sense of the contours of what Korea has gone through up until today. Because clearly, even if we spent a whole week, I wouldn't be able to do all the details of Korea. But I want you guys to take away some of the things that I find most interesting about why Korea is something worth studying, right? And I'm going to leave you with, I want to start with a question, which I don't expect you to be able to answer. But how many times did Japan and China invade Korea? Does anybody know? I didn't know before I started doing this research. You don't have to give me a number, but does anybody think they could come up with an answer? You guys are too well trained. This will not be on the test. Yeah, I mean, the popular perception is that Korea has just been constantly invaded. And I'm going to give you a different story, actually, and one that shows a lot more stability in East Asia, which for those of you who do world history or whatever else, is actually, I think, one of the most interesting things about East Asian history, is how it actually worked, right? Because if we go to Europe, and we all know this, right? The history of Europe is a blood-soaked series of unending wars against each other. From the 100 Years' War, the 7 Years' War, the, just on and on and on, right? In Europe, you had a bunch of similarly sized states, kingdoms, whatever, that spent centuries beating the stuffing out of each other. And the best way to show this is if you put a map. So this is Europe in 1300. And we have a whole bunch of political units here that don't exist anymore. And in fact, the Europe that we know today really didn't even begin to come into focus until the 19th century. So borders in Europe changed constantly as kingdoms rose and fell and people conquered each other and moved back and forth. The Europe that we know today is actually really recent. Now, in contrast, in East Asia, the four main states of East Asia, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and China, have basically existed for well over 1,000 years. Their borders changed a little bit, but these are identifiably the same units. And so Korea became Korea around the 7th century. Now, there's a lot of historical debate over this kingdom called Goguryeo. But essentially, there were three kingdoms on the Korean peninsula. Before then, the Baekje, Shilla, and Goguryeo. This Kaya was a smaller thing. Before then, around 200 AD, there were a bunch of little tribes, things back and forth. These kingdoms developed around 200, so that by 600 AD, you had basically three large kingdoms. Yamato Japan, the Japanese state that we know today, roughly traces its emergence to around the 6th or 7th century. Before then, again, just a bunch of little tribes or something. But there we can trace a political heritage. Now, the interesting thing is that here there was a world war. There was a world war, meaning everybody who could be involved was involved. Right? So the Japanese allied with Baekje, Shilla allied with Tang, China. Shilla and Tang crushed Goguryeo. They then beat up Baekje, and the Japanese sent some troops. They sent them home. Joseon dynasty of 1400, they had basically filled out to what it looks like today. Right here is, again, wilderness mountains. And that was settled and demarcated between China and Korea in the 18th century, 1711. Now, why is this interesting? Literally 1,000 years, this river has been the border between China and Korea. That's an astonishing amount of stability between two recognizably political units that exist today. In 1592, in the Imjinweran, this Japanese general Hideyoshi decided he was going to invade China, and to get there he had to go through Korea. So, what did he do? He invaded, at one point it was almost 200,000 soldiers. They crossed these 50 miles of water on 700 ships and invaded Korea. Korea defended with 60,000 troops. Isun Shin had turtle boats, mercilessly cut their supply lines. That was a world war also at the time. Now, what's interesting about this is about the same time, 1588, in Europe, there was the Spanish Armada. You guys have heard of that, right? The Spanish Armada has been called, let me make sure I get this right, the greatest military force ever assembled in Renaissance Europe when the Spanish tried to invade England. And they invaded with about 30,000 troops, and they were defeated by about 20,000 English troops. The point is, the war in East Asia was about 5 to 10 times the scale that Europe could even imagine creating. And now this is really interesting, because not only did this war dwarf the scale of European wars. I mean, when these guys decided to fight, they could do it on a scale you could not imagine in Europe. They had the logistical, military, organizational capacity to get together hundreds of thousands of soldiers. So when they decided to fight, they could really fight. And yet, in some ways, this is the only war between the three of these for about 12 centuries. There was that world war I told you about at the beginning, you know, in Goguryeo, when we ended up with the sort of unified Korea. And then you get to 1894, 1870, depending on when you want to call, when the Japanese and Chinese began fighting again. And in between, there's only one war. But they clearly could do it. It's not that they couldn't take 100,000 guys and go across water. And so the question must be, why didn't they fight? And that's what I get to, you know, I talk a lot more in my book. Why didn't they fight more? But also just the mere fact that there weren't that much more fighting is worth noting, especially when we start to compare it to Europe and the incessant invasions between France and Europe. At that time, I actually counted up, between 1300 and 1900, there were 43 times that France and England were involved in wars. Right? So this is actually quite interesting, right? So why? These are old, powerful, organized countries. These aren't just a bunch of scattered tribesmen walking around not fighting with each other. And so this is what's interesting. When we talk about these major mobilizations, we have very few. In the interest of time, let me just keep going on, right? Because that all ended in the 20th century. These centuries of stability disappeared with the arrival of the West and the transformation of East Asia, which had been a very stable international system with extensive countries, trading, diplomats, whatever else. But it was done one way. And then almost overnight, within the space of a generation, the arrival of the West, the beginning of sort of semi-imperialism, colonization of China, and the colonization of everybody else, changed all of East Asia. And so the 20th century is what I'm going to spend the next half hour or so, and then we can talk about whatever you want, right? Which is, for centuries of stability, you see that in the 20th century in Korea and East Asia, extraordinary tumult. Just astonishing amount of change.